Hello, everybody. You are watching Political. My name is Connor Allen, and I'm here, as ever, with my co-host, Yaron Smith.
Hello, everyone.
And you're watching Political People, a show where we give Americans, ordinary Americans, just like you, a chance to express their opinions, express their views, and get past the polls, get past the media noise, and get to the crux of what America thinks. So without any further ado, we're going to introduce our special guest today. Her name is Hannah. Say hello, Hannah.
Hello.
And we're going to be talking with Hannah a bit about her political beliefs, a bit about her unique perspective on society, why she votes the way she does, and much more over the course of this episode. So before we do get into it, guys, please do, if you like this content, drop us a like, subscribe if you want to support the channel, and share this if you think people will be interested in it. It's the best thing you can do to support the channel. So, Hannah, tell us a bit about yourself. I mean, who are you? Where do you live? Where do you vote? Who are you as a person?
Right. So, I mean, that's a very broad question, but I am a woman. That's, I think, probably the best place to start out, and that does inform my perspective a bit, I think. I am a registered independent, as it happens. I have to be, because I am socially liberal, and in fact, much more socially liberal than the Democrats tend to be. And I'm also fiscally conservative, so I'm not very well covered by either of the major parties. I am a political realist. I'm an incrementalist. I don't believe in complete overhaul of systems and replacement with new systems with just as many flaws in them. And I'm also an expat. I currently live outside of the United States, which means that I have for several years now had to vote by post, if you will. Although technically for me it's by email. And in this particular election, despite my very varied voting history, I decided to vote for Jo Jorgensen.
Okay, and Jo Jorgensen is the leader of the Libertarians, correct?
That's correct. She is the current head of the Libertarian Party.
Okay, perfect. Just for our viewers who perhaps are from Europe and are completely surprised that a woman is running in the US presidential election, or indeed for our American viewers who are equally as surprised. Hannah, why libertarian, though? What attracted you towards the libertarians?
Libertarianism was one of those things that kind of came at me kind of unexpectedly, I have to say. I know when I was younger and a bit more impressionable, Democrats would tell me that, oh, you know, the libertarian perspective, oh, those libertarians, they're all really gun-toting, you know, evil white supremacist people who are way too conservative to even be Republicans. Meanwhile, the Republicans would turn around and they would say, oh, well, you know, those people are quasi-communist, crazy people who have, you know, not even the appeal of the Democrats. So they're really not either of those things, but there are a lot of really harsh, really terrible misconceptions. And I think that there's really a vested interest by the two major parties in keeping any third party down, but particularly a party with as much appeal as the Libertarian Party does have, quite frankly.
Okay. So you've already voted Libertarian, just quickly?
I have done, yeah. I got my postal ballot in the email on the 2nd of October, and I sent my completed ballot back on the same day.
And is this the first time then you voted for the Libertarian Party, or have you voted for them in 2016? Or
so this is my fourth presidential election. The first time I voted, I went McCain. The second time I voted, I actually voted for Obama to be retained in office. The third time, I didn't have a fixed permanent address and I couldn't vote. And This is the first time that I've ever voted third party.
Right. And is that, I guess, Is that because you're more inspired by the libertarian message now, or more turned off by the Republican and Democratic candidates?
It's definitely a matter of being more turned off by the other candidates. To be quite honest, as a political realist, voting strategically has typically been kind of my forte. I like to vote for people who I think have a chance of winning. That being said, I do see an opportunity, with as poor as the candidates are at this point, to potentially knock off one of the major political parties, because we've always had two parties. We've always had two. But the way that it was before the 1860s, when the two that we currently have got fixed in place, is that it used to be every 10 to 15 years we'd knock off a party and a new party would rise in its place. And honestly, with as poor of a job as the Republicans and Democrats tend to be doing at the moment, I do think at least one of them needs to be replaced by a group that's a bit more in touch with particularly young voters.
I mean, would you say perhaps it might make more sense for them to splinter off into separate parties, particularly the Democrats, because their base is obviously quite split now anyway between progressives and more sort of moderates?
That's possible. That's entirely possible. They could definitely take a very different tact. But I do think that you have far too much division within the Democratic Party to really form a cohesive whole that isn't already taken up by an existing third party.
Right, yeah. So you mean like obviously the Green Party or whatever set effectively have the same progressive policy on climate change and that kind of thing.
Right. So it's more likely, in my opinion, just sort of looking at the lay of the land, that you'd end up with people, even if they tried to form a completely different Democratic Party, would find themselves more drawn to third parties, which already have those particular parts of the political spectrum covered.
Right.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because there does seem to be an undercurrent of the desire to have more parties there. I mean, we look at the Tea Party movement, even in 2016, was really, at least to me, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, to me that was a reflection of a kind of widening split, a widening gulf in opinions in the right. I mean, yeah, you just mentioned the left, but it happens in the Republicans too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is a generational issue at play at the moment. I think that there's definitely old Republicans and old Democrats versus new Republicans and new Democrats. And quite frankly, either the parties are going to have to really pivot in the next 10 to 15 years, or they're going to find themselves completely out of touch.
And you mentioned before that you're a strategic voter then. So a lot of people are put off voting for third parties because they think it's a wasted vote, but it sounds like you don't think this has been a wasted vote at all.
Look, I'm very aware that Dr. Jorgensen has absolutely no chance of becoming president this time around. That being said, she couldn't even get into the debates. She wasn't even taken that seriously, and very often, when you look at how the chips fall after an election in the United States, libertarians aren't just a third party; they're the third party. They always come in third everywhere but California. So there's really no reason that they should have been kept off of the stage. There's no reason other than that, Fox and CNN are basically the ones who arrange the debates, and they're going to put, two centenarian individuals up on the stage, and this younger woman is going to walk in, and I'm sure all of the people who are thinking about voting would turn around and say, well, that's very interesting. That's not what we expected.
Do you think? Sorry, yeah, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, because obviously we've kind of in the UK we obviously have the same first past the post system, which tends to lead to two main parties. but obviously, the debates is something that we've started to do here recently, a bit more coming up to elections, which I think obviously is an idea borrowed from American culture. But I do recall, I think in the last election, we had a kind of opposition debate. So everybody but the incumbent party would kind of debate, and then that gave, I thought that was like a good way of finding a balance between allowing the main opposition to debate the main opposition, to debate the actual incumbents, but then also include all of the kind of fringe parties as well. Do you think that that's like a good middle ground, or at least somewhere where they could begin with? Or do you just think they should, get Libertarian, Green, Republican, Democrat, have them all in one big debate, and then that's it?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I were given my choice, I would say that at the very least, the first debate or the first few debates should have as many parties represented as possible, because then you get the widest possible series of, let's say, ideas presented to the American public that they then get to choose from. And I won't say that I, for example, don't think that the Republicans and the Democrats will end up being the main winners every time, but it will put pressure on those two main parties to be a little bit more proactive than they currently are, if the American people at the beginning of that race have an idea that there's actually a wider possible platform here, that you don't just have to repeat yourself election after election.
Just going to the kind of character of Jo Jorgensen, I mean, let's face it, she is a woman, okay? And that scientific insight from Conor Allen. That obviously matters where, I mean, we saw in the vice presidential debate, there were many accusations of Mike Pence talking over Kamala Harris and talking over Susan Page. I think they were nonsense, but the accusations were there. Do you think there needs to be a female on the platform to kind of balance out these, as you said, two septuagenarian old white men?
To be completely honest, I don't think that there needs to be a woman in every single race. I think that being willing to give women a platform is a necessary predisposition for being taken seriously by me personally as a voter. And I don't really see that as a current running through either party at the moment.
Okay. Were you at all swayed towards Jo Jorgensen as a person because you share the same gender, or?
No. I was swayed towards libertarianism because I saw that the first time libertarians ever put forward presidential contenders, they put a woman on the ticket, and that they've consistently done so since that first time in the 70s, that they were 20 years ahead of the Democrats in putting a woman on the ticket, and that they actually practice what they preach, in the sense that they have, for a very long time now, long before the Democrats would ever manage, had openly gay representatives, openly trans representatives, people who the supposedly liberal Democrats have marginalized because, 51% of voters wouldn't have approved.
So before we move on to talking about the other parties and obviously Trump and Biden and everything that's been going on in the election, I suppose I really kind of want to know. I think most people know, obviously, like broadly what the Libertarian Party stands for.
You'd be very surprised.
Okay. Well, most people that are interested in politics and likely to be watching this video probably have a vague idea or a reasonable idea of what the Libertarian Party would stand for. I know I've seen polls where they'll say, which candidate do you prefer? And then for the Libertarian or the Green Party candidates, they'll be like, oh, I don't know who that was, like 20% of people. But like just in terms of broadly like their policies, what is it about the platform that they have and the policies that they have, their manifesto, that you like really particularly appeals to you?
Well, as I mentioned before, I do like that they're much more inclusive than the Democrats are. They're more left-leaning socially than the Democrats are. They're also more fiscally conservative, which I'm particularly drawn to as a trained economist. Announcing my biases there a little bit. Granted, Bloomington School, not Chicago School, but nevertheless,
No one's perfect.
Yes, especially poor Bloomington School economists. That's an economist joke.
The highbrow humor of political.
So, I mean, there were a lot of things that drew me to libertarianism. To be quite honest, it's not just the fact that they tend to be socially liberal and fiscally conservative. They're much more interested in sort of lower level governance, or governance at more of a state level. And while I know that there's a huge push against that by a lot of people, and they really find suspicion in that, oh, well, what if the state does something I don't want my state to do? What kind of precedent would that create? The courts, this, that, and the other thing. I really do think with the size of the United States that doing things, subnationally is actually really vital. Because if you think about the size of the United States, if you were to compare it to Europe, you would have to compare it to the entirety of Europe. Iceland over to the Ural Mountains, top of, Norway, all the way down to the bottom of the Iberian Peninsula and all of Turkey. It's huge. And you can't treat the entire country as though it's exactly the same. You have completely different mixes of agricultural, industrial, and service-based economies. You have huge areas of the United States that are 98% African American, for example. You have completely different demographic factors in terms of age. You can't treat every state in the United States as exactly the same. And I really enjoy that libertarians in particular take that to heart and recognize that, it's not a one-size-fits-all sort of experience in government.
So it's fair to say you're kind of an advocate of lower government, smaller government, and less interference, I say.
Right. I'm not one of those people who thinks that government has no place. Certainly, I think that it does have a certain specific place, making up for market inefficiencies and helping individuals who are poor in particular to be able to make the most of what's available to them and to make up for any deficiencies in the way that society treats them, quite frankly. Not every deficiency, obviously, but anything that's an inefficiency, particularly of the free market. That being said, I really prefer their platform.
Okay. Well, thanks for that, Hannah. I think we've got a pretty good overview of who you are as a person, trained economist, libertarian.
I'd love to sit and debate the free market now for the next hour, but I feel like we need to. I feel like we need to move on at this point.
And if you do want us to sit and debate the free market for an hour, let us know in the comments down below, and we will provide if the people demand it. So I think that's section one complete. We know who you are as a person now, Hannah. We know the perspective you're approaching things. We know the particular lens through which you're seeing US politics, or indeed all politics. So we're going to go and on ahead now, and we're going to ask about a few of the issues in news. And I can tell from the sighing that Yayan is ready to go with the first question. So I will graciously give him the first question.
I wasn't sighing at all. Yeah, but I mean, actually, it's kind of quite that we ended on talking about state rights and the difference between governing at the federal and state level, because I think if we're going to talk about the election now, the biggest, obviously, encompassing issue of all of it is the coronavirus, and more specifically the handling of the coronavirus. Obviously, Biden's attack on Trump is that it's been an utter failure, and Trump hasn't shown leadership. And Trump's kind of, I suppose, side of the argument is, well, it's down to the state governors to handle it in their own way, and we've provided the support that we can on the state level. So I know it's a broad question, but just, I suppose, overall, how do you feel about Trump's handling of the coronavirus, or just, not even just Trump, but in general, America's handling of the coronavirus?
Well, I think that again, there's very much an urban versus rural divide in the United States that actually makes this particularly relevant politically. With a country as large as the United States, it's really not possible to lock down everything at once and still be expected to be taken seriously. The problem is when New York City was having this major outbreak of coronavirus, everybody panicked. Everybody shut away every part of the United States, no matter how rural it was, no matter how unconnected it was. And people were expected to stay in their homes and not go to work and not make money and not be able to buy food because somewhere on the coast, thousands of miles away, there were a bunch of people getting sick. And don't get me wrong, I'm not going to minimize coronavirus. I remember the last pandemic in the States, my whole family got very, very ill with the swine flu that came through, a decade ago now.
Yeah, 11 years, I think.
Yeah. My whole family got sick, and my stepfather even was turned away from the hospital because they said, look, we have people dying in hallways. We can't get them in beds. I understand that it is possible for something like coronavirus to get into more rural areas. I get that. That being said, it's not going to magically transform itself and float through the wind currents from New York City to Montana in the matter of hours that they seem to think that it could. I really don't think it was appropriate to lock everything down as quickly as they did. That being said, a lot of that was up to the states. We had imperfect information, and I certainly understand where people are coming from if they say, you know what, I don't really like the idea of locking down because California is having an outbreak. I don't really like the idea of locking down because New York is having an outbreak. We really need to do this at a more regional level. And as far as that's concerned, while I know a lot of people see that as a lack of strength, I really see allowing people to govern themselves more regionally as strength itself.
Right, so it's a more efficient way of handling the situation, right? Because obviously, you lock down the whole country, then it's just a whole waste of an economy in many ways. But so, so do you then hold the I don't know, I would say responsibility, but maybe that's the right word, responsibility more than with state governors? And do you think that really it's up to them and the mayors in the individual cities and stuff to make those decisions, or do you support things like a nationwide mass mandate if that was constitutionally possible?
Mm-hmm. I do think that it needs to be done much more at a state and especially at a local level. That being said, I do think it's important for people to wear masks. The big problem I have with enforcing mask wearing is that it's not really possible to know for sure who 100% needs to wear a mask and who has some sort of medical exemption. So I'm less likely to go hard on the idea that people should be forced to wear masks. There are definitely going to be very inconsiderate people who really ought to wear them, who have no excuse not to, but who feel mildly inconvenienced. And I'm not in favor of that, but at the same time, I think you'd harm people by making it mandatory. So I'm not really in favor of forcing people to wear masks if they don't want to, unless you're on private property, of course. If a store or a restaurant or something says you have to wear it, then you have to wear it.
We've all seen these people walking around with masks underneath their chin. These, incredibly
in hair
people.
salons and
yeah, exactly. That's a kind of product of enforced mask wearing on too large a scale, I believe.
I mean, I think it speaks to the what we were just talking about before with the market, is that if a business decides that they want to create or have the perception of a COVID-free or a COVID-safe environment, and they say that you can't come into our store unless you've got masks on. Now I feel like that's their choice, right? But yeah, I don't know. I've got nothing else on that one. Connor, do you have anything else on coronavirus?
Well, yeah, I mean, so Hannah, what do you? I mean, you mentioned that your family unfortunately suffered with the swine flu, and you saw the response of the Obama Biden administration there, and now we're seeing the Trump Pence administration deal with coronavirus. Having both of those experiences, do you think? Can you perhaps just give us a kind of compare and contrast on the two administrations' responses? Whether you're satisfied with Trump's response, if you think he's done all he can, or not, as it may be, and the same with Biden.
Right. So legislatively, at least, I think that Trump has done about as much as he can. Now, do I think that he should have come out and been, pro-mask wearing for other people's sake? Yeah, I think that he should have done that instead of treating it like it was some sort of ridiculous piece of costume and making a point of making fun of Joe Biden for wearing one. That being said, looking back, I do think that this was taken more seriously than swine flu was back in the day, and I can tell you that I have a lot of friends who are Democrats, but the vast majority of them don't remember swine flu at all because it never hit the big cities, right? It never became a big issue because it didn't really hit the East Coast the way that it hit other parts of the United States. And so it wasn't considered that big of a deal. And they don't know anybody who got sick. And there's a real, I don't really know how to call it, hypocrisy probably in that, because swine flu didn't really start out in the coasts, and so it wasn't taken seriously, and there weren't these big lockdowns. Granted, it wasn't nearly as deadly, but if it had really hit the coast as badly as it hit the Midwest, you would have seen a completely different outcome. And more than anything, I'm really disappointed by the lack of movement by the Obama administration on that particular account, rather than wishing that there had been more done this time.
Do you think the Democrats are therefore justified to be, especially Biden himself, to be attacking Trump quite repeatedly on the coronavirus response?
Well, it depends on what they're attacking him for, quite frankly. Trying to get him to do more as the president? No, I don't think that that's justified. I think that as the president, he's very much come up against the limitations of his office. Because remember, the president isn't even realistically the most powerful political player in the United States, as much as we might like to point at him and say that he should be. The head of the United States government, realistically, is the Senate. If you want to get anything done, you have to go through the Senate. So if you want to point fingers at anybody, you've got a completely different branch of government that you need to be pointing at. That being said, if you're talking about, of course, President Trump's treatment of masks as a person, yes, I do think that there is something to be desired there. And I do think that there is a point to be made by saying, look, you wear one now, you recognize that it's necessary. What have you learned, and what positive can you bring out of this? Even if you don't want to be the mudslinging kind of contestant, you can definitely say, look, you've changed your mind. Can you please try to make other people understand why that is?
So that concludes part one of this episode of Political People. We actually spoke to Hannah to such a great length, we decided it would be best to split this up into two videos. So this concludes part one. In part two, we'll be discussing Black Lives Matter, mail-in ballots, Trump's tax returns, and Biden's fitness to be president. So please tune in for that one. That one will be released tomorrow night. So if you haven't already, subscribe and hit the notification bell.